When I earlier returned from Bike Week and saw my neighbor kissing my wife, I recorded everything on video, and karma caught up with them for their lies. And then, I've always prided myself on being a man of precision. Every decision I've made, every risk I've taken, led me to where I am today. At 48, I own one of the largest motorcycle chains in the country, Mitchell's Motors Star. It wasn't handed to me either. I built it from the ground up, starting with a small shop in Dallas when I was 25, and now I've got 20 stores across Texas, Florida, and California. I've got a house that turns heads in Highland Park, a garage full of the best motorcycles money can buy, and a family that, on paper, seems perfect. Sarah and I have been married for 20 years. She's 5 years younger than me, and we've built a pretty comfortable life together. 3 kids, all healthy and bright. Emily, our oldest, is 19 and already a sophomore at Stanford. Jason, 16, is a talented football player and robotics geek, and Lily, our youngest, just turned 12 and is obsessed with horses. I'll be honest, I love my kids, but I've never been the type to hover over their lives. Sarah does most of that. Maybe that's where the distance between us started, with me working so much and her always busy with her social stuff. Charity events, brunches, yoga. I'd be away a lot too, not just for the business, but for my own escapes. Riding motorcycles isn't just my job, it's my life. Every year, I hit the biggest rallies. Sturgis, Daytona, even up to Canada for the Friday the 13th thing in Port Dover. It's my way of letting go, feeling alive. The road clears my head, gives me peace. And maybe, just maybe, it's given me too much distance from home. I came back from Sturgis 2 days early this time. Some meetings I had lined up got canceled, so I figured, why not surprise the family? It was a Saturday, so I expected to pull up to the usual scene. Jason out in the yard tossing a football, Lily running around with the dog, Sarah probably having friends over. But when I rolled into the driveway, the house was dead quiet. No cars in the driveway. No noise. Just silence. I parked my new Harley in the garage, took a moment to wipe it down. The Sturgis crowd had loved this bike, a Harley-Davidson Road King with custom detailing. I just dropped a small fortune on it, but it was worth every penny. When I finished, I headed back toward the house, still wondering why it felt like a ghost town. That's when I saw her. Sarah. She was walking out of Steven Anderson's house. Now, Steven's our neighbor, lives right across the street. He's 52, runs a chain of car dealerships in the area. We're friendly enough. Not buddies, but we've had drinks at a few neighborhood parties. His wife, Jennifer, is always nice, and they've got 2 teenage boys, Matt and Ryan. Nothing ever seemed off about Steven. Until now. I stood there, just watching. At first, I thought Sarah was just dropping by, maybe borrowing something or chatting with Steven. But then he stepped out after her. And it happened. He kissed her. And not some quick, friendly kiss either. Full-on lips, his arm wrapped around her waist. And Sarah, she kissed him back. She looked happy. I don't know what hit me first, shock, anger, disbelief. But my hands moved on their own. I grabbed my phone, zoomed in, and took a picture. My fingers were shaking, but I managed to get it. A part of me wanted to march across the street right then and there, demand an explanation, knock Steven's smug face in. But I didn't. Instead, I walked back to the garage like nothing had happened. I needed to think. By the time I made it inside, the house was still empty. I dropped my helmet on the kitchen counter, leaned against the wall, and stared at my phone. The picture was crystal clear. Sarah and Steven, wrapped up in each other like I didn't exist. I could call her, right now, demand answers. But something inside me held back. No, I needed time. I needed to play this smart. That evening, she walked through the front door around 6 o'clock, acting like she'd spent the day at yoga or a lunch with her friends. "Hey, babe," she said, all smiles. "How was Sturgis?" I looked at her. I could have laid it all out right there, asked her where she really was. But instead, I smiled back and said, "It was great. Glad to be home, though." For the next few days, I kept playing the role of the clueless husband. I'd leave for work, come home on time, listen to her talk about her day. I even took her out to dinner one night, pretending that nothing was wrong. But every time I looked at her, all I could think about was that kiss, that picture on my phone. I couldn't handle it alone. So, I called up Matt Rhodes, an old friend who'd retired from the Dallas Police Department last year. Matt had been a detective for 25 years, and he was damn good at it too. He'd seen it all: cheaters, liars, and scumbags. If anyone could help me figure out what to do next, it was him. We met up for lunch at this little diner on the outskirts of town, a place no one would recognize us. I told him everything, showed him the picture. He didn't say much at first, just nodded and sipped his coffee. "This kind of thing happens all the time," Matt finally said, setting his cup down. "What's your move?" I sat there for a moment, thinking. My gut reaction was to confront Sarah, blow it all up. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. If I went nuclear, I'd risk losing everything. My family, my reputation, my business. No, I wanted something else. Something that would make her regret what she did without me ending up the loser in the story. "I want revenge," I said, my voice low. "But I need to be smart about it. I don't want to lose everything." Matt nodded again, a small smile playing on his lips. "I can help with that." And just like that, we started making a plan. Matt had been around enough cheaters to know how they operated. First, we needed more information. I had no idea how long this had been going on, or if it was just Steven, or if there were others. So, I had to play the long game. Keep cool, gather evidence, and stay one step ahead. Within a few days, we had everything set up. I installed hidden cameras in the house, one in the living room, another in the kitchen, and one outside by the garage. I synced them to my phone so I could monitor things in real time, but I also set up a separate email account to store all the footage. If Sarah was going to keep sneaking around, I'd be ready. And she did. It didn't take long for the cameras to pick up what I already suspected. Sarah was still visiting Steven, slipping out when his wife was gone, heading over there when she thought I wasn't watching. Sometimes it was just for a few minutes. Other times, she'd be gone for hours. I didn't lose my cool. I didn't confront her. I didn't even mention that I knew. Instead, I played the role of the perfect husband. Attentive, caring, completely in the dark. But every day, my anger simmered beneath the surface. And soon, when everything was in place, I'd strike. I'd always prided myself on being one step ahead, whether in business or life. Now, more than ever, I needed that edge. After Matt and I laid the groundwork, I knew the next steps wouldn't be quick or easy. Sarah and Steven had no idea what was coming. This wasn't going to be a short game. It was a slow, methodical plan. I needed to make Sarah and Steven expose themselves, and I needed to do it in a way that left no room for denials. For a few days, I maintained the facade of a clueless, content husband. I woke up next to Sarah every morning, made my coffee like usual, kissed her goodbye when she left for her yoga classes or lunch dates. I watched as she came home at the end of the day, smiling like everything was perfect, but I knew better. My cameras were feeding me every bit of information I needed. I didn't even need to go through hours of footage. The moment she crossed the street to Steven's house, I had alerts set up to ping my phone. It was almost laughable how predictable they were. But now, it was time to push things further. First, I started dropping small hints. Nothing too obvious, just little things to unsettle her. One evening, while we were sitting in the living room watching TV, I casually mentioned that Steven's car was in the shop. "Saw Steven's Mustang over at Lone Star Auto," I said, glancing at her from the corner of my eye. "Something wrong with it?" Her reaction was subtle, but I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she hesitated before answering. "Oh, I'm not sure," she said, eyes flicking back to the TV. "I haven't talked to him much lately." I smiled, nodding like I believed her, but I could tell the gears in her head were starting to turn. Next, I had to make her nervous. Over the next few days, I began to schedule random things at the last minute. A business trip to Houston, canceled at the 11th hour. A weekend getaway with the kids to Austin that got postponed when I told her work had called me back unexpectedly. Each time, I'd act disappointed, but I could see the tension building in her. She had no way of knowing when I'd be home or when I'd be gone. I knew Steven lived a predictable life, which made things easier for me. He was usually at his car dealerships during the day, and his wife, Jennifer, was almost always running around town. Tennis lessons, brunches, committee meetings for the school. With her busy schedule, Jennifer was out of the house most days between noon and 5. Sarah knew that, too, and she made sure to slip over to Steven's during that window. I started tweaking that schedule. One afternoon, I told Sarah I'd be working late at the shop, but just after 1 p.m., I pulled up in front of the house as if I'd forgotten my wallet. I stepped inside and acted surprised to find her still there. "I thought you had lunch with Grace," I said, referring to one of her friends from the neighborhood. Sarah froze for just a second, then smiled. "We moved it to tomorrow," she replied casually, though I could see her mind scrambling to explain why she was still home. I nodded and grabbed my wallet, leaving just as quickly as I'd come. I knew she'd be more careful after that, but that was the point, to make her nervous, to make her second-guess every move she made. Over time, I noticed her getting more cautious. The trips to Steven's house became shorter, more sporadic. She'd leave for a few minutes at a time, just long enough for a quick conversation or kiss. She thought she was covering her tracks, but I was recording everything. It wasn't enough for me to catch them in secret. I needed them to expose themselves in front of others, in front of people who mattered. And I knew exactly how to set the stage. In Highland Park, there were always events, charity galas, neighborhood parties, and the like. The perfect opportunity came when the Andersons threw their annual summer barbecue. Every year, they invited the entire neighborhood over, and it was always a big event. Sarah and I had attended every year since we moved in, and I knew this year would be no different. The day of the barbecue, I made sure everything looked normal. I played the loving husband, helping Sarah pick out her outfit, making small talk about who we'd see at the party. Inside, though, I was waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down for her. We arrived at the Andersons' house around noon. The backyard was set up with tables, a bar, and a massive grill where Steven was showing off his legendary grilling skills. Guests were scattered around, chatting in small groups, while kids ran around playing. Jennifer greeted us with her usual smile, though I couldn't help but notice how oblivious she was to what was going on under her own roof. As the afternoon wore on, I watched Sarah and Steven closely. They were careful, as I expected. Sarah spent most of the time with her friends, while Steven busied himself with the grill and entertaining the guests. But every now and then, their eyes would meet across the yard. It was subtle, but it was there. The glances, the small smiles. They thought they were being discreet, but I saw every detail. I bided my time, making small talk with the neighbors, acting like everything was normal. I waited for the right moment, and when it came, I was ready. It was late afternoon when Steven announced that he'd be taking a short break from the grill. "Be right back," he called out to the crowd, heading inside the house for what I assumed was a quick breather. Sarah, as if on cue, excused herself from her group of friends and followed him inside. This was it. I waited a few minutes, then casually made my way inside the house. No one noticed me slip away from the party. I'd already scouted the layout of the house earlier that week when Steven had invited me over for a quick chat about a new Harley he was thinking of buying. I knew exactly where they'd go. The upstairs guest bedroom, the one at the end of the hallway that no one ever used. I crept up the stairs, heart pounding, though I kept my cool. When I reached the bedroom door, I didn't burst in. I stood there for a moment, listening. I heard their voices, low, intimate. It was exactly what I expected. But instead of barging in, I turned on my phone. I had a small, portable speaker connected to it, one that I'd planted earlier in the day when we'd first arrived. It was hidden in the bushes near the patio, where most of the guests were gathered. I pressed play, and a few seconds later, Sarah's voice echoed through the speaker, soft at first, but unmistakable. The recording I'd taken earlier that week played loud and clear for the entire backyard to hear. It was Sarah, talking to Steven in one of their secret rendezvous. Her voice, laughing, teasing, telling Steven how much she looked forward to next time. The reaction was immediate. The conversations outside came to a sudden halt. I heard gasps, murmurs of confusion. Then Jennifer's voice, shocked, angry. "Is that Sarah?" I knew the guests were scrambling, trying to figure out what was going on, but I didn't need to see their reactions. I was focused on the two people behind the bedroom door. I heard them inside, panicking, scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Then I pushed the door open. Sarah and Steven froze. Sarah's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock and fear. Stephen stood there, his mouth hanging open, completely at a loss for words. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The damage was done. I turned and walked back downstairs, leaving the door wide open behind me. Outside, the guests were still reeling from the recording. Sarah's friends, Stephen's colleagues, Jennifer. All of them knew the truth now. I walked over to Matt, who had been standing by the bar the whole time, watching everything unfold with a quiet smirk. He nodded at me, and we both knew the plan had worked. Sarah and Stephen's secret was out, and there was no coming back from this. As I grabbed a beer and leaned against the fence, watching the chaos around me, I felt a sense of calm. Everything had played out exactly as I'd planned. Sarah and Stephen were exposed, their lives unraveling in front of everyone they knew. And I hadn't even had to lift a finger. Now, it was time to watch them face the consequences. The moment Sarah and Stephen's betrayal went public, the entire neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Highland Park wasn't a place where secrets stayed buried for long, and what unfolded at the Andersons' barbecue spread faster than a wildfire in July. The next morning, I could feel the shift. I wasn't about to let them control the narrative, but I knew Sarah well enough to predict her next move. She would try to twist this to her advantage, to play the victim and turn the blame on me. But what she didn't know was that I had already anticipated every step she'd take. That Monday morning, the call started. Sarah had probably been up all night, reaching out to her close circle, Grace Thompson, Olivia Carter, and the rest of her high society friends. I could imagine the conversations, her soft voice cracking as she told them how I had become distant, how my work consumed me, how she had felt so alone in this massive house with me gone all the time. I was sure she would throw in the motorcycle trips, painting them as my escapes from the family, leaving her neglected and vulnerable. The real kick was when she spun it for the kids. I was sitting in my office at Mitchell's Motors, staring at the numbers for the upcoming quarter when Emily called. She was in California, still recovering from midterms at Stanford, but I could hear the tension in her voice as soon as I picked up. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked, not sounding like her usual composed self. "Sure, Em. What's going on?" There was a pause, and I knew what was coming. Mom called me last night. She told me about the party and what happened. I stayed silent, letting her finish. "She said you set her up, that you've been distant for months, maybe longer." She made it sound like this was your fault. I exhaled, not in frustration, but because I expected it. "Emily, your mother is trying to control the situation. I'm not going to go into details, but I didn't set her up. She got herself into this mess." Emily was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear her thinking. She'd always been the most analytical of the kids. "So, is it true? Is she with Mr. Anderson?" "Yeah, it's true," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But don't let her make this about me. I know how she'll try to spin it. She'll say I've been too focused on work, that I've been gone too much. But that doesn't excuse what she did." Emily sighed, and I could tell she was torn. "I don't know, Dad. I don't want to pick sides. I'm just confused." I didn't blame her. Sarah had probably worked all her charm on Emily, knowing that she'd be the easiest to sway. "I get it, Em. I'm not asking you to pick sides. Just don't believe everything you hear from her right now. She's desperate." We hung up not long after, but I knew Emily wasn't the only one Sarah had tried to manipulate. Jason had been more difficult to reach, not responding to my calls or texts for days. When I finally cornered him in the garage, working on one of his robotics projects, I saw the same conflicted look in his eyes. "Mom said you've been keeping secrets," he said, his voice low. I nodded. "I have been, but not the kind she's trying to tell you about." Jason looked up from the mess of wires and circuit boards. "Is it true? About her and Mr. Anderson?" "Yeah, it is," I said, not sugarcoating it. He was 16, old enough to hear the truth without it being watered down. "But she'll say whatever she needs to say to cover her own tracks. Don't let her guilt you into thinking this is my fault." He didn't say much after that, just nodded and went back to his work. I could tell he was trying to process everything. I gave him space. He'd come around when he was ready. Meanwhile, Sarah wasn't just working on the kids. She'd been reaching out to our mutual friends, trying to rally support, trying to make herself out to be the victim of a cold, distant husband. I started hearing from people who hadn't called in months, people like John and Diane Michaels, who lived 2 blocks over. They had been friends of ours for years, but their tone was different now, more cautious, more curious. "Derek, we're just concerned," John said over the phone. "Sarah's been saying some things, and we wanted to hear your side of it." I knew what they wanted. A story, something to satisfy their curiosity. But I wasn't about to give it to them. "John, this is between Sarah and me. I appreciate the concern, but you're not getting pulled into this." Diane jumped in next. "She just sounded so upset, Derek. She said you've been gone a lot, and she feels—" I cut her off. "Not in the mood for sympathy. She can feel however she wants, Diane. Doesn't change what happened." After that, the calls from mutual friends tapered off. Sarah could say whatever she wanted, but I wasn't going to defend myself to people who were just looking for gossip. The real battle was with Sarah, and it was about to get messy. The first step of my real plan started that same week. I had already consulted with my lawyer, Gary Rutledge, one of the best in Dallas when it came to divorce law and financial disputes. I knew this wasn't going to be a clean split, especially with the assets we had. But I had no intention of walking away empty-handed, and Sarah had no idea how vulnerable she was. Gary laid out the strategy clearly during our first meeting at his office downtown. "We need to hit her where it hurts, Derek. She'll go after alimony and the house, maybe even some of your business interests, but I can make sure she leaves with far less than she expects." I nodded, leaning forward in the leather chair. "I'm not interested in dragging this out, but I want her to feel it." Gary smirked. "She will. I've already started filing the paperwork. Our biggest leverage is that you've been the primary earner for the past 20 years, and she's largely dependent on you financially. That puts you in a strong position." The financial blow I had planned for Sarah wasn't just about cutting off her income. I had more than enough evidence of her affair with Stephen, which meant we could use that to reduce any alimony or property claims she might have. Texas law was on my side when it came to proving infidelity, and Gary assured me we had a rock-solid case. But that was just one part of the plan. The other part was Stephen. Stephen thought he could slither out of this unscathed, but he didn't know I had been digging into his business. I had already hired a private investigator, Alan Crosby, to look into Stephen's dealerships. Alan had been working quietly, gathering information on some shady financial dealings that Stephen had been involved in. It wasn't anything that would land him in jail, but it was enough to ruin his reputation and jeopardize his business. Alan's report came in later that week. He had uncovered a few key details that would make Stephen squirm. Under-the-table deals with suppliers, unreported income, and a couple of bribes that he had paid to city officials to push through building permits for new dealerships. It wasn't the kind of information that would hold up in a criminal court, but in the court of public opinion, it would destroy him. I arranged a meeting with Matthew Green, a local journalist who covered the business sector in Dallas. Matthew had always been eager for a scoop, and when I dropped the details of Stephen's dealings in his lap, his eyes lit up. "Are you sure about this?" Matthew asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Positive," I said, sliding the report across the table. "You'll find everything you need right here. I'm just giving you the story. What you do with it is up to you." Matthew didn't need much convincing. A week later, the story broke on the front page of the Dallas Business Journal. The headline read, "Local Dealership Mogul Caught in Financial Scandal." It was a hit piece, carefully crafted, but it did the job. Within hours, Stephen's phone was probably blowing up with calls from lawyers, investors, and clients, all demanding explanations. Meanwhile, I kept my distance, letting the chaos unfold on its own. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to do anything more. I had set the wheels in motion, and now Stephen's business would start to crumble. His reputation would take a hit, his relationships with his investors would fracture, and his family. Well, I imagine Jennifer wasn't too thrilled with the news. The legal and financial trap I had set for Sarah was just as meticulous. A few days after the story on Stephen broke, I filed for divorce. Sarah wasn't expecting it, not this soon, and definitely not with the weight of the evidence I had against her. She called me in a panic the morning she got served. "Derek, what the hell is this?" she asked, her voice shaking over the phone. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied calmly. "I'm done. We can work this out. You don't need to do this. I smiled to myself. She was desperate now. She knew she was in trouble. I'm not interested in working anything out, Sarah. You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. For the next few weeks, I let my lawyers handle the details. Sarah tried to fight back, but the evidence of her affair with Stephen crippled her case. She had no leverage, and everything was stacked against her. In the end, she'd be left with far less than she had hoped for. She might have thought she could manipulate the situation, turn it in her favor, but I had anticipated every move she'd make. Now, as her world slowly crumbled around her, I could finally watch as Sarah and Stephen dealt with the fallout of their dirty play. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. I thought I'd seen it all when it came to betrayal, but Sarah and Stephen weren't done. They'd been humiliated, their reputations shattered in front of everyone who mattered, but instead of retreating, they dug in. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. This was about survival, and they were ready to go all the way to protect themselves. What they didn't know was that I had prepared for every dirty trick they could throw my way. I wasn't about to let them get the upper hand. The first sign that the war had escalated came on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was in my office, going over sales numbers for the Dallas and Austin locations of Mitchell's Motors. The business had been strong, and I'd been thinking about expanding into Arizona, but as I sat there, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Gary Rutledge, my lawyer. Derek, Gary said without preamble. We've got a situation. I leaned back in my chair, my gut already telling me what this was about. Go on. Sarah's lawyer sent over a new motion. They're trying to subpoena financial records from your early years in business. Something about questionable deals with suppliers in your first few years of operation. I felt a flicker of irritation, but not surprise. Let me guess, Sarah's trying to blackmail me with this? Gary hesitated. Looks that way. They're implying that if certain documents come to light, it could cause you reputational damage. Sarah's betting on you folding to avoid that. I knew exactly what Sarah was playing at. Back when I started Mitchell's Motors, I had to make some tough decisions to keep the business afloat. I had worked with some aggressive suppliers who weren't exactly playing by the book, but it had been years ago. Everything had been cleaned up since then, and the business was now one of the most respected in the region. But Sarah knew those early deals, and she knew the right people to dig them up. That's her move? Weak, I said. She's bluffing. What do we have to worry about? Gary sighed. Not much in terms of legal repercussions, but if she leaks the information to the media, it could affect your reputation, especially if the narrative spins out of control. The press loves stories about shady beginnings. I'd built my empire from the ground up, and it wouldn't be knocked over by a few headlines. But Sarah was betting I'd panic. She thought I'd scramble to protect my name, maybe even settle the divorce on her terms just to keep everything quiet. She was wrong. Don't engage, I told Gary. Let her play her hand. We're not backing down. If Sarah wanted a fight, I'd give her one. But I wasn't about to sit around waiting for her next move. I started working on my own counterattack. I called up Alan Crosby, the private investigator who had already helped me expose Stephen's financial wrongdoings. I knew he was thorough, and I needed him to dig deeper into Sarah's activities. There was more going on. I could feel it. Something bigger than just the affair. Alan, I need everything you can find on Sarah, I told him during our meeting at a small cafe just outside downtown Dallas. I don't care how small or insignificant it seems. I want leverage. Alan gave a quick nod, understanding the stakes. I'll get on it. While Alan went to work, Stephen made his next move. I found out through one of my contacts that Stephen had been using his business connections to try and damage Mitchell's Motors. He had friends in the auto industry, old boys from his days at the University of Texas, big names in the Dallas business community. He was calling in favors, trying to push me out of key supplier contracts and disrupt my relationships with the dealerships that carried our custom bikes. But Stephen underestimated me. He thought his network could cripple mine, but I had been in the game long enough to know where my strengths lay. My connections ran deep, not just in the motorcycle industry but beyond. I had allies, people who owed me favors, people who respected what I had built. I made a few calls of my own. First, I reached out to Jack Malone, the CEO of Roadstar Parts, a major supplier that worked with both my shops and Stephen's dealerships. Jack and I went back years. We'd been doing business since the early days of Mitchell's Motors, and I had always made sure our partnership was profitable for both sides. Derek, what's going on with you and Steven? Jack asked when I met him for lunch at Nick and Sam's in Uptown Dallas. Steven's trying to squeeze me out, I replied bluntly. He thinks he can cut off my suppliers and sabotage my business. Jack raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a risky move. I nodded. It is. But I'm not worried about Steven. I'm worried about keeping our deal intact. We've both made a lot of money together, Jack. I don't think you want to see that change. Jack smiled, taking a sip of his scotch. You don't have to worry about Redditstar, Derek. Our contract stands. Steven can talk all he wants, but I don't turn my back on partners who've made me money. With that reassurance, I left the meeting feeling more confident. Steven might have his connections, but my relationships were stronger. He wouldn't be able to shut me down as easily as he thought. Meanwhile, Sarah was doubling down on her blackmail attempts. She tried to call me a few times, but I didn't pick up. Instead, she sent me an email, carefully worded but full of threats. She implied that if I didn't settle this amicably, she would go public with everything. My early business deals, the financial shortcuts I had taken, and even some personal matters that she knew would embarrass me. What she didn't know was that I had already anticipated this. I forwarded the email to Gary, who sent a response to Sarah's lawyer, warning them that any attempt at blackmail would be met with a defamation lawsuit. I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. While I waited for Sarah's next move, Alan came through with new information. I had expected some dirt on Sarah, maybe a hidden bank account or some undisclosed spending, but what Alan found was bigger than that. Derek, Alan said when he came to my office to deliver his report, Sarah's been moving money. I frowned, flipping through the pages he'd handed me. Moving money where? She's been funneling funds into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It's been happening for a few years, small amounts at first, but recently the transfers have gotten bigger. That caught my attention. How much are we talking about? Over $500,000, Alan replied. She's been hiding it under an LLC registered to a shell company in Miami. From what I can tell, she was preparing for this divorce long before you caught her with Steven. That hit me harder than anything else so far. Sarah had been planning her escape for years. The affair with Steven was just the tip of the iceberg. She had been positioning herself financially, making sure she could walk away with a pile of cash that I didn't even know about. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. Sarah thought she was clever, but she had just handed me exactly what I needed. This kind of financial misconduct would destroy her in court. I forwarded the information to Gary, who was already preparing the case. As the war raged on, Steven made one last attempt to take me down. He started a smear campaign, using his business contacts to spread rumors about Mitchell's Motors, that our products were substandard, that we were cutting corners on safety. It didn't take long for the rumors to reach me. One of my top sales managers, Lucas Brady, called me from our flagship store in Austin. Derek, we've had a couple of clients cancel orders. They heard that our bikes aren't safe. There's a rumor going around that we had a recall, but I can't find any record of it. I clenched my jaw. That's because it's not true. It's Steven Anderson trying to sabotage us. Lucas cursed under his breath. What do you want me to do? Get ahead of it, I said. Release a statement through our PR team. Make it clear that there are no recalls, no safety issues, and that this is nothing but false rumors. And get in touch with our loyal clients. Let them know they can trust us. Within hours, the PR team had put out a strong statement, and I personally called some of our biggest clients to reassure them. The smear campaign started to lose steam, and Steven's plan backfired. Instead of damaging Mitchell's Motors, his lies made him look desperate. In the midst of all this, I received an unexpected call from Jennifer Anderson, Steven's wife. We had barely spoken since the barbecue, but now she sounded shaken, her voice barely above a whisper. Derek, I don't know what to do, she said. Steven's falling apart. He's drinking all the time, and he's talking about leaving Dallas, selling the dealerships. I didn't sign up for this. I wasn't sure how to respond. Jennifer had been a bystander in all of this, but now she was caught in the middle of the fallout. What do you want from me, Jennifer? I want to know how bad it is, she said. What's Steven done? I paused, debating how much to tell her. He's crossed a line he can't come back from. His business is crumbling, and his reputation is shot. If I were you, I'd be making plans to protect myself. Jennifer was silent for a moment. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered. Believe it, I said, my voice cold. It's happening. With every move they made, Sarah and Stephen were digging themselves deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of. And I was content to let them. I wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The war wasn't over, but the balance of power was tipping in my favor. Now, it was only a matter of time before they destroyed themselves. Everything had been leading up to this. Months of planning, watching, waiting. Sarah and Stephen thought they could play dirty, but they underestimated just how far I was willing to go. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. No, this was about something more, something final. They had destroyed the life I thought I had, but now it was time for me to destroy theirs, in full view of everyone who mattered. The first blow came when I officially filed for divorce. It wasn't a quiet filing. I wanted it to be as public as possible. I wanted Sarah to feel the weight of every accusation as it hit her. The petition went through the Dallas County District Court, and my lawyers included everything: infidelity, financial misconduct, and the hidden offshore accounts Alan had discovered. The second part of the filing was the custody battle. I wasn't just asking for a split custody agreement. I wanted full custody of Jason and Lily. Emily was 19, in college at Stanford, and could make her own decisions, but Jason and Lily? They were still young enough to be swayed, and I wasn't about to let Sarah keep manipulating them. I was going for full custody, with Sarah being reduced to supervised visits. In Texas, the courts typically favored joint custody, but I had something powerful: hard evidence of Sarah's affair and her financial betrayal. Gary, my lawyer, laid it out for me before we filed. The courts don't often go for full custody without a strong reason, he said, leaning back in his leather chair in his downtown office. But with the evidence we have, especially the offshore accounts, you have a real shot. They won't let her walk away with much, if anything. I nodded. What about visitation? If you win full custody, she could be limited to seeing the kids on weekends or during certain holidays, but under strict terms. We're talking a few weekends a month, max. She'll have to prove she's stable before the court even considers giving her more time with them. That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the kids the way she tried to manipulate me. The moment Sarah was served, all hell broke loose. She started calling, texting, dozens of messages, each more frantic than the last. I ignored them all. I let Gary handle her lawyer while I kept my distance, staying focused on my next moves. The fallout from the divorce filing hit Sarah hard. Her circle of friends, once so tight-knit, started to distance themselves. The story was too juicy to ignore. Sarah Mitchell, the perfect Highland Park housewife, caught in an affair with the neighbor, embroiled in a scandal involving offshore accounts. Grace Thompson and Olivia Carter, her closest friends, stopped answering her calls. Even the women at her yoga class began whispering behind her back. The isolation was palpable. Stephen, on the other hand, had bigger problems. The story about his financial misconduct had spread like wildfire through the Dallas business community. Thanks to the article Matthew Green published in the Dallas Business Journal, Stephen was losing clients left and right. A few of his key investors in the car dealerships started pulling out, and his partners began to distance themselves from him publicly. It was one thing for Stephen to have his personal life exposed, but in the world of business, reputation was everything. I heard through the grapevine that his meetings with North Texas Auto Group, one of his largest buyers, had been canceled. He was hemorrhaging support faster than he could patch the leaks. I heard about it from David Lawson, a mutual business acquaintance, when we bumped into each other at a networking event in downtown Dallas. You heard about Stephen, right? David asked, swirling his drink as we stood by the bar. I played it cool. Yeah, I heard something. David chuckled. He's done. No one's going to touch him after that article. You can't run a business when people don't trust you. I just nodded, feeling the satisfaction settle in. Stephen's empire was crumbling, and I didn't have to lift a finger. It was collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. But the real showdown was yet to come: the court battle for custody and the finalization of the divorce. The court date was set for mid-September, just before Jason's junior football season kicked off. I had prepared for this day like it was a business negotiation, methodically, carefully, with all the evidence lined up and ready to go. Gary had warned me that Sarah's lawyer, Megan Carter, was aggressive, but we had the facts on our side. We arrived at the Dallas County Family Court on a humid Monday morning. Sarah was already there, standing with Megan, trying to appear composed. But I saw the cracks. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a manila folder, and her face was pale. This wasn't a fight she was prepared to win, and she knew it. The judge, Honorable Barbara Phillips, took her seat at the front of the courtroom. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, which suited me just fine. There wouldn't be any theatrics in her courtroom, just facts. Gary began by presenting the evidence we had gathered, the photos of Sarah and Stephen, the bank statements showing her offshore accounts, and the financial discrepancies that Alan had uncovered. It was all laid out meticulously, piece by piece. Sarah's lawyer tried to shift the narrative, portraying Sarah as a victim of my emotional distance and neglect. Megan Carter argued that Sarah had been left alone for too long, that my business trips and motorcycle rallies had created a void in the marriage. But the judge wasn't having it. Ms. Mitchell's actions go beyond emotional grievances, Judge Phillips said, cutting through the argument. Infidelity and financial misconduct cannot be excused by marital dissatisfaction. Megan tried to fight back, bringing up my long hours at work, my trips to Sturgis and Daytona, but none of it stuck. The evidence against Sarah was overwhelming, and the judge wasn't swayed by emotional appeals. The custody battle was the next focus. Gary argued that Sarah's infidelity and financial deceit proved she was unfit to have joint custody of Jason and Lily. He presented the evidence of her offshore accounts, showing that she had been siphoning money away for years, preparing for a life without me, and without the kids, if necessary. Megan countered, arguing that Sarah was a dedicated mother, that she had always been there for the children, but the judge remained skeptical. A dedicated mother doesn't hide money in offshore accounts while planning her escape, Judge Phillips said firmly. After several hours of testimony and cross-examinations, the judge gave her ruling. Full custody was awarded to me. Sarah was granted visitation rights, 2 weekends a month, supervised, for the first 6 months. After that, the court would reassess, but only if Sarah could prove she was financially stable and mentally fit. Sarah's face crumpled when the ruling was read. She tried to maintain her composure, but the reality of the situation was too much for her to hide. She had lost not only the marriage, but the kids, the house, and the life she had built around her lies. Outside the courtroom, I finally felt a sense of closure. Gary shook my hand, a satisfied look on his face. That went better than expected. I nodded, watching as Sarah and Megan huddled together, whispering furiously. She never stood a chance, I said. The legal battle was over, but the aftermath lingered. Sarah had been reduced to almost nothing. The court had stripped her of most of her financial claims, leaving her with only a small settlement, just enough to cover her basic living expenses. The house in Highland Park? Mine. The majority of our shared assets? Mine. She walked away with next to nothing, while I retained everything I had built. Stephen, meanwhile, was still trying to salvage his business, but it was too late. By the time the court case wrapped up, his largest investors had pulled out, and several of his dealerships were in the process of being sold off to competitors. He had gone from being one of the most respected businessmen in Dallas to a pariah, someone whose name was whispered about in back rooms and board meetings as a cautionary tale. The final confrontation came when I saw Stephen face-to-face at a charity gala a few weeks after the court ruling. He looked worn down, the weight of his downfall visible in the lines on his face and the slump of his shoulders. He tried to avoid me, but there was no escaping the inevitable. "You lost everything," I said, stepping in front of him near the bar. He didn't meet my eyes, just stared into his drink. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice hollow. "You should have stayed out of my life, Stephen. You could have walked away." He finally looked up, his expression one of defeat. "I didn't think it would end like this." I smiled, not with joy, but with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served. "You never saw it coming." As I walked away, I felt a sense of finality. The war was over. Sarah and Stephen were both destroyed, not just by what I had done, but by their own actions. They had tried to tear my life apart, but in the end, they had only torn apart their own. Now, it was time to move on. My life, my business, my kids, they were still mine. I had come out on top, not because I was better than them, but because I had been willing to fight for what mattered. And in the end, that made all the difference. The courtroom battles, the confrontations, the war in the shadows, it was all over now. I had won, but the thrill of victory didn't linger. It wasn't that kind of victory. I wasn't celebrating. Instead, it felt like something had settled inside me, a sense of finality that couldn't be easily shaken off. I'd come out on top, but at what cost? I still had my business, my house, and my kids, but life had taken a turn, and now I had to figure out how to move forward. I had to decide what life would look like after all of this. After the trial ended, I took a step back from the business for a while. Mitchell's Motors was still thriving, especially the Texas locations in Dallas, Austin, and Houston. I had a solid team in place, with Lucas Brady managing the flagship store in Austin and overseeing expansion projects. The business was in good hands, and for once, I didn't feel the need to hover over it. I had spent the last 2 decades building it from the ground up, and now I needed to focus on something else, my family and myself. I had custody of Jason and Lily now, and while they were still adjusting to the aftermath of the divorce, I wanted to be there for them in a way I hadn't been before. Jason was busy with football, getting ready for his junior season at Highland Park High School, while also diving deeper into robotics. Lily, just 12, was still figuring out who she was, and after everything that had happened with Sarah, I knew she needed guidance. I started spending more time with them, taking Jason to his football practices and showing up at his robotics competitions. I even got involved in his projects, helping him design a new kind of suspension system for one of his models. He reminded me of myself when I was younger, focused, determined, always trying to fix or improve something. Jason was resilient, but I knew the divorce had affected him more than he let on. Lily was a different story. She was quieter, more withdrawn after everything. I took her to her horseback riding lessons every week, but I could tell something was off. So, one Saturday, I asked her if she wanted to take a road trip with me, just the 2 of us. We took the Harley, the same one I'd had since I was her age. I had rebuilt it with my grandfather, a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead, one of the most expensive classic models out there now, sitting proudly in my private motorcycle museum. That Panhead meant the world to me. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, had been a mechanic his whole life, running a small motorcycle workshop just outside Dallas. I spent every summer there as a kid, watching him fix up bikes, learning the ins and outs of engines and transmissions. When I turned 15, he let me start working on that old Panhead with him. We spent months restoring it, piece by piece, and by the time it was done, I knew that motorcycles would always be a part of my life. That bike wasn't just a machine. It was a memory, a connection to who I was and where I came from. As Lily and I rode out of town that weekend, winding through the backroads of Texas, I felt like I was reconnecting with her in a way that had been missing since the divorce. We stopped in Fredericksburg, a small town in the hill country, and spent the night there. Over dinner, she finally opened up. "I miss Mom," she said quietly, poking at her food. "I know you do," I said, watching her carefully. "It's okay to miss her." "Do you miss her?" Lily asked, her eyes meeting mine. It was a loaded question, and I didn't want to lie to her. "I miss the person she used to be," I said. "But people change, and sometimes we have to move on." Lily didn't say much after that, but I could tell it was something she needed to hear. The next day, we rode back to Dallas, and while things weren't magically fixed, I felt like we had taken a step in the right direction. I was going to be there for her, and for Jason, no matter what. As for Sarah, her life had changed forever. After the court ruling, she lost more than just custody. Her social circle had crumbled, and she was left with almost nothing. The house, the cars, the money, it was all gone. She tried to appeal the decision, but the court wasn't sympathetic. The evidence of her financial misconduct, combined with the infidelity, had sealed her fate. She was left with just enough money to survive, but not enough to maintain the life she had been used to. I heard through mutual friends that she moved to Bastrop, a small town east of Austin. She rented a small house there, far from the glamorous life she had once lived in Highland Park. Grace Thompson told me Sarah had tried reaching out to her, but no one from the old crowd wanted anything to do with her anymore. She was forgotten, just another scandal from the past. Then, something happened. I heard from David Lawson, one of my business contacts, that Sarah had been involved in some sort of incident in Bastrop. Apparently, she had been dating a local guy, someone much younger, and there had been an altercation at a bar one night. It ended with Sarah being escorted out by the police, her reputation in tatters even in this small town where no one knew her story. It was shocking to hear, but in some strange way, it didn't surprise me. She had always tried to live beyond her means, always chasing something that was just out of reach. Now, she was left with nothing. Stephen, on the other hand, was a different story. His fall from grace had been more dramatic. After losing the car dealerships, his family, and most of his business contacts, Stephen disappeared for a while. No one really knew where he went until I got a call from Jennifer Anderson, his ex-wife, months later. "Derek, I thought you should know," Jennifer said, her voice steady but tired. "Stephen's in Brazil. He moved there after the divorce." I raised an eyebrow. "Brazil?" "Yeah, with some old friend of his from college. They're living near Salvador in a fishing village." It sounded like the kind of place Stephen would run to when things got bad. No responsibilities, no one to answer to. But Jennifer's voice changed when she told me what had happened next. He had an accident. Fell off a boat while drunk. They were fishing, and he slipped. A shark bit him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A shark? Yeah. Took off part of his leg. They managed to get him to a hospital, but he barely survived. The wound took months to heal, probably about 8 months, according to the doctors. I sat there, stunned. I had been expecting Stephen to fall apart, but not like this. "What's he doing now?" Jennifer sighed. "Not much. He's staying with his friend, but from what I hear, he started begging. He's got no money left, and no one wants to help him." I thanked Jennifer for telling me, but after we hung up, I couldn't shake the image of Stephen. Once a powerful, successful man, now broken and lost, begging on the streets of some fishing village in Brazil. It was hard to feel any sympathy for him. He had done this to himself. Life moved on after that. The kids and I settled into a routine. Jason's football team made it to the state playoffs that year, and I was there for every game, cheering him on from the stands. Lily started getting more serious about her horseback riding, and I even bought her a new horse for her 13th birthday, a beautiful chestnut mare she named Bella. As for me, I found myself spending more time in my workshop, just like I had when I was a kid with my grandfather. I had kept his old workshop intact, just outside Dallas, and it had become my sanctuary over the years. I'd restored dozens of bikes there, but none meant more to me than that 1948 Panhead. It still sat in my private collection, perfectly preserved, a reminder of where it all began. I had learned a lot from my grandfather in that workshop. Patience, hard work, the satisfaction of building something with your hands. Those lessons had stayed with me through all the ups and downs of my life, and now they were more important than ever. I had won the war, but I had also learned that winning wasn't everything. In the end, it was the people who stood by you, the memories you built, and the legacy you left behind that mattered. Jason and Lily were my future, and I was determined to make sure they grew up with the same values my grandfather had instilled in me. As for Sarah and Stephen, they had chosen their paths. They were part of my past now, and that's where they would stay. I had moved on, and for the first time in a long time, I was at peace. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.